Get started. All right. My name is Jeremy Mikola. I was here yesterday. This will be a slightly more serious talk. I'll let you decide, though. Talk is entitled 5 Years of Beta, and I'll get to what the subject matter will be about in a bit. But to quickly introduce myself, as I didn't do so yesterday, I work in New York City on MongoDB. I work with Derek Rethens on the PHP driver. I've been there for about 4 years, and before then had done a few companies doing Symphony development. Also a member of the Doctrine core team. As Benjamin said, there's about 16 of us that work on a variety of projects, and that's mostly what I'm going to be discussing today. And I've also done some contributions to React PHP for child processes, and then Symphony, although I have not touched that in about 4 years. But apparently I'm still ranked as a top contributor from when we did it previously. And it keeps getting me invited to these things, so I'm happy to keep it that way. And then if you were at the after party yesterday, I also run a hot dog conference, so I won't talk any more about that. But if you'd like stickers for either Doctrine or WorstCon, we have stickers here, and Benjamin has some as well we can hand out for you. So I have a bunch of accomplishments in the Symphony community, and then now in Mongo. Now, as far as the subject of the talk, when I was talking to Mark about it and giving him the idea, 4 years ago I gave a talk about being an open source contributor. And it's pretty long, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the summary was that I was suggesting that an open source project needs 4 different types of contributors. You need people to evangelize the project, so someone like Lucas Smith does for Symphony. You needed documentation writers like Ryan Weaver does in the docs team. You needed support people. If you've worked with Symphony pull requests at all, Stoff is the person that comes to mind, is always popping in to review pull requests or respond to issues. And then you also need the actual development team. So those are the 4 things that you needed for an open source project. And this was geared as a talk for contributors to get people more interested in contributing. Not really necessary now. Symphony has so many more contributors as well as the Doctrine projects. But that's where we were 4 years ago. But the talk today is not a technical talk, so I don't have code to put up on slides. So if you want to leave early for dinner, you can do that now before we get started. That's fine. But it's going to be a story about Doctrine MongoDB ODM as the example, because that's the project that I've interacted with for the last 6 years. But it's going to be from the other side. Instead of what contributors can do, it's going to be from the side of running the open source project. So the 2 things to introduce first are, and Benjamin did a bit of this already, but what is the Doctrine organization? So if most people have worked with Symphony, you've more than likely worked with a database, and you've probably also worked with Doctrine. It's not like in Symphony 1 where we had Propel and Doctrine. Now in Symphony 2, it's basically Doctrine by default. So it's a collection of projects, not just database projects. There's libraries like the caching or the key value store. And it's split between the ORM is the known project that has existed for the last maybe 10 or longer years from version 1. But then since then, we have these extra projects. We have the ODMs, which are instead of object relational, it's object document mappers. And those, as Benjamin mentioned, exist for a variety of different database backends. And MongoDB happened to be the first of that, and is probably the larger of the 4. There's some other weird ones on here, like an XML ODM that didn't deserve to be mentioned. But then in addition to this, we have these cache libraries, we have migrations libraries, and things that support this ecosystem, as well as all the integrating with frameworks, like the Symfony bundles or the Zen framework modules and the Symphony bridge. And then on the MongoDB side, it's primarily a web-scale database. We could laugh about that, that's fine. But in addition to that, aside from being an open source database, which is, thankfully, I was using it 5 and 6 years ago, so I have all some of the horror stories that people had back then. It's matured a lot in the last 8 years. And now they're focusing more on doing cloud services, and then where I fall in, all the way at the bottom, is working on drivers team, both the PHP and the HHVM driver. And so a fusion of those two things gives us the Doctrine ODM project. So if we go back in time, if you will, join me, and we go back to the very first release of Symphony. And this is back in 2010, I want to say 2010, yes. And so this was not even a beta, I think it was version public release or preview release 3. I don't know where the first and second one were. And so Fabian tagged this. This was probably the first working version of Symphony that was, wouldn't call it stable, but it was usable. So it had the basics of a request and a response. And now who was using this back then? This was the crazy people were using it back then. So we had about 4 companies here. KNP Labs, which is well before Ryan had got there. They were contracted to develop exercise.com. We have Leap, which is where Lucas and where Jordy from Composer, Jordy used to work there as well. And they're still doing Symphony 2 and other development today. And then you had OpenSky. And OpenSky and Exercise were the 2 known websites that were using it very early before the release. And this was a time there was no form component, there was none, so much of it was still unimplemented. It didn't look very much like we see it today. And the challenge, I happened to be at OpenSky at the time, the challenge we had there was as an e-commerce website, and in summary, they had Magento. It was not scaling well. They had hundreds of stores. It was not the use case to use Magento properly. And so they realized they needed a custom application. And even though they were a startup and they could be out of business next year, they decided, let's think years down the line. PHP 5.3 had just come out in the last year or so. So we want to pick a framework that is the cutting edge that we're going to be stuck with for the next 5-6 years. And so of the ones they considered, they ultimately went with Symphony 2. And MongoDB at the time, their office was across the street, which was great if you needed support. You just go downstairs, go across the street, go upstairs, ask your question. It was a really great relationship, and it was a fun time to be, which was good because the database was a lot worse then too. So it was a lot of trips across the street. But this architectural challenge, Symphony 2 addressed it, and they ended up using MongoDB a bit after. And we presented about this. It was the first time I ever gave any kind of public talk was Symphony Live Paris in 2011. We gave a talk. It was some of us from OpenSky as well as KNP Labs and as well as Leap gave a group talk, Symphony from the Trenches. And this was long before Composer existed. Jordy hadn't yet started to develop that. And if anyone remembers how Symphony handled dependencies back then, there were basically 2 scripts early on. This is before we had the deps. After this, we would have the deps file. But there was one shell script to install everything, which was just go into directories and clone Git modules. And then when we go update them, we'd go into the directories, and then we'd do git pull on everything. There's no tags here because you don't need stability. You're using Symfony vpr3. And as well as you saw early on, we both had Doctrine, and then Propel was there as well. And Propel was still on SVN. And so this, if anything, could tell you why we needed Composer. These 2 slides are a pretty good example. And so I remember at OpenSky, we'd go in and we got used to using Git and then having to go in and upgrade our submodules all the time. And at the time, we were using, there was Doctrine 1, was the main version of Doctrine, implemented a active record pattern, as did Propel. That was the design pattern. And so your entities on your classes, they would know how to save themselves or update themselves. You'd have, maybe your user class would have a static method called find that would then do the database query, give you back a user object. And then this design pattern stuck around with Symfony, and then as well as Rails, Ruby. It's very popular, very simple to implement. But with Doctrine 2, when the guys came together, they decided they wanted a more forward-thinking, mature approach. And initially, this did not sit well with the PHP community at all. Like nowadays, we take it for granted this is the way things are done. But early on, this was like, why are you bringing Java into PHP? Which is kind of a half-hearted joke, but it's also the Doctrine 2 was modeled after Hibernate in Java. So it gave us the data mapper pattern, which then, as we know today, if we've worked with Doctrine, we have a manager that manages our entities, and then our are actual database entities are just normal classes that aren't responsible for saving themselves or anything. They don't know about the database. So it really separates your database from your domain objects. And so the very first release of Doctrine 2 coming to beta, and this was included with Symfony VPR3. And this was back in April in 2010, and this was the beta 1 release. And then Propel would come much later. Ultimately, the next version of Propel, I think, was built upon Doctrine. But so this was for SQL databases. And now these two guys had an idea. The gentleman on the left is John Wage. He came up in Benjamin's talk. If you worked with Symfony long enough, you might remember him. He was way more active in Symfony 1 when he was writing books and doing consulting. He worked for Sensio Labs. And at this time, he was living in Nashville and working on his own. And in his spare time, he just wanted to come up with this project. He later, within a year, ended up joining OpenSky. And the guy on the right is Bulat. If anyone has used the Imagine library for working with images in PHP, Bulat authored that. So he was at OpenSky for a while and has since gone on to other companies. But they had an idea to take Doctrine, of which John was already contributing, and port it over to MongoDB. And so what were going to be the things that they would have to tackle for that? They were going to look at the ORM and take the essential functionality. So this is the version 2, the good data mapper pattern. And they'll take the very essential things, so how do we map our classes, the unit of work, which watches the changes and calculates how we write them back to database. All the events, which gives us a common interface if we have plugins like timestamps or slugs, as well as persistence of how to write back to the database. And so that's where things start changing, because now writing to Mongo is much different than SQL. And they were going to ignore the things that they didn't really care about. So anything OpenSky didn't need and anything John wasn't working with himself, they're not going to waste time doing this right now. We'll deal with it later. So that meant there was no, in Doctrine ORM, you have the debal, which is to abstract all the different SQL drivers. So whether you work with MySQL or Postgres or SQL Server, you have a consistent API. Since this was an ODM for just MongoDB, we really didn't need that. We ended up creating it later. But things like sharding, nobody was using sharding back then, at least definitely no PHP people. So why waste time dealing with that? And things like database migrations and caching. So they would just delay these till later. And so quickly soon after, and they really just did this in a matter of months. So soon after Doctrine 2 was released in beta, we had the first beta of the ODM. This was over the summer. And I remember I had been at OpenSky for 2 or 3 months at the time, and we were already integrating into our application and then using submodules even before this tag. Bulat would come in, and he was basically a full-time employee, but he was spending at least half of his time working on the ODM. And in the meantime, that was when I was doing all the fun Symfony 2 stuff, and I proudly never had to touch Magento. But if we go back to 2010, 2011, at the beginning of the ODM, if we go to the GitHub repository, you could see the initial spurt of all that activity for the spring of 2010, where they were developing really quickly, writing a lot of code. And then Chris Wellsmith, who also would later work at OpenSky, was working on this. Ornikar, if anyone remembers him, he has some bundles to his name. He was working for KNP Labs at the time, and this is before he read a book on Scala and decided to give up PHP entirely. But back then, he was writing PHP. And so this gives you a sense of really the only people using this, and we were using it in production because we were madmen. And then if we go on to the next 4 years, which is going to be kind of talked through in this talk, John Wage was still around. Bulat had left. Exercise.com would go out of business. Ornikar would go start doing Scala. Chris Wellsmith moved on to do Ascetic and other Symfony contributions. And basically, I was left here with John Wage. And you see John Wage didn't really do much either. And this was around the time when I was leaving OpenSky and then joining MongoDB to work on the driver. And I didn't know how to write PHP extensions yet. So I did what I could. I knew how to write PHP at the time in 2012. And so I started maintaining the ODM. And it was like a community project, because otherwise there was nobody to do the work. And then towards the end of this, we'll get into where we are today. You see John and I are still kind of there in the background, and we have two new guys here that I'll get into where they showed up from. So why did it take 5 years? And that's the pivotal question here. We went 5 years from having the first beta release to having the 1.0 stable release. And it's kind of a running joke, but it did eventually happen. We did eventually get a stable release. So why did this take so long? Well, a lot of the time was always keeping up, and these principles will apply just to general open source projects. In our case, we were keeping up with the flow of both the progress of Doctrine and then the rest of the community. And so this is in that 4 years when I was really the only one maintaining things. And this is Benjamin and the rest of the ORM team, and they have a full sailboat, and I'm stuck swimming in the ocean. It's hard to keep up. And so there was this to-do list in running, and these apply as much to Symfony, or if anyone in the audience has open source projects, these might seem familiar. So you have interdependencies with other projects, both of things that other libraries you use or other projects are using your library. And there's a task to maintain compatibility with these things because the ecosystem is constantly changing and developing. In our case, in the ODM's case, the MongoDB server, new versions would come out every 6 months or 8 months. They would have new features that we might have to support, or they might break things. When you're dealing with a database, Benjamin and the guys that work on DBAL could tell you from all the MySQL or Postgres between versions, there's no sense of like semantic versioning for database projects. It's not like a new major version. The queries might change, the languages might change a little bit. The drivers can change. Doctrine Common is this common set of libraries, things like annotations, collections, that are shared between all the Doctrine projects. So it was important that if a new version of that came about, we had people using both ORM and ODM. We have to make sure that we support the latest version of that common library, because otherwise Composer would not let you have both installed. So we don't want to block people from upgrading. And then framework integrations. So how many people here have a Symfony bundle that they maintain? Mostly just the front row, some people up in the back here on the side. When a new version of Symfony came out, the most recent pull request I remember, when Symfony 3.0 came out, to update Composer to allow Symfony 3.0, because the old bundles from a long time ago just said Symfony 2.x, not thinking that 3 would be a long time away. But all the bundles and the modules would have to constantly be updated as well. And then we also had these Doctrine extensions, which was a community library that integrates, not by anyone on the Doctrine team, that implements these behaviors for your classes that you can use for ORM or for the ODMs. And then community support was every day waking up and finding that people either have questions, bug reports, or pull requests that they want reviewed. And that never stops. And then less likely, though, I will say the security vulnerabilities was never too much of a concern. There was a security audit back when Fabian raised money and did a security audit for Symfony, and they did Doctrine as well back then. So we've had very few security vulnerabilities over time. But that's a never-ending to-do item that you have to maintain in your projects. This is just a list of, over the time I was maintaining Doctrine, and it's not meant to be legible, but these are all the issues I opened against the MongoDB server, complaining that things weren't working or you broke stuff from version to version. And I noticed this because I was using the ODM, and it was a great test both for the PHP driver and then for the database itself. And a lot of these did not get fixed, or some of these are still waiting to be fixed. And so we have to implement workarounds, and that was just took time. It was a taxing effort. In addition, we would have pull requests where people just want to add a simple feature. In this case, the person wanted an extra type for a mapping to be added that ORM had. It didn't really make sense in ODM. They just wanted it. It was very easy for them to do it in their application and then have a custom type, because we can extend it just like the Doctrine extensions do. But he just wanted it in the library itself because it'd be easier. And you have to watch out for that. Because accepting even the smallest pull request means that you're now committing to supporting that. If I already have a ball of yarn and it's very messy, then I'm accepting this other small feature. I'm going to have to be maintaining this in addition to everything I have, and the test cases. Maybe they're submitting pull requests without test cases as well. So this is something as a maintainer to be vigilant about and what you accept as features. A lot of pull requests have been submitted even to Symfony, where people had an idea maybe for a component or a bundle or extra options that just do not to go back and forth with the core team, and they say, there's really not a reason for this. You can do it yourself. Here's the way you should be doing it, or make another community bundle, but we don't want to put it into core. So you have to be protective of what you take in, especially if you can't manage existing tasks already. Be careful about taking more on. And then so while I was doing these things and making time for what I could, which is the previous slide, there was this wish list of things that I knew I would want to get done. And so every time the ORM guys would make a new feature, I'd hate them for it, because then somebody would come over and say, oh, why can't we have this in the ODM? And whether that was some of these made it into we ended up implementing, some of them we didn't, just because there wasn't enough resources or effort to put towards it. And then in addition to their features that people wanted, there were the features that we wanted ourselves. So I mentioned that originally we never implemented sharding, we never implemented a lot of extra features that weren't being used in 2010. But eventually we would want to get around to these. We had issues waiting, they were triaged, and so when we get to this is on the wish list. There was always refactoring. If you maintain any project of your own, it's kind of soothing or therapeutic to just go and clean up your code. And go into especially parts of the internals of Doctrine that are pretty messy. You can get lost in there trying to clean things up, and then when it's done, you feel good about yourself. But you didn't really change anything for the users. And so it's important to weigh how much refactoring you do versus how much things you do that actually affect the users. And then the one that came about more recently in the last 2 years was PHP 7 support. And this was not a problem for Doctrine and as well as HHVM support. Not so much an issue for the Doctrine code itself, but more for the PHP driver, because we weren't supporting PHP 7 at the time. And we eventually did, but in the form of a new extension with a very different API, which was definitely going to be an issue for getting Doctrine ODM ported over. It would basically require it to be rewritten. And so these are 2 pull requests. One, a criteria API. This was something we pulled in that people requested from ORM. I was able to do that myself. And then we have ones where people added the feature, which was appreciated. And usually when someone did add something from ORM, they were able to get their test framework, their tests as well, so that there's usually high-quality pull requests. But it did mean that later we're going to have to maintain this. So it's still an expense. And then there is a bad example here of sharding, where as early as 2011, we had someone give us a pull request for sharding, but it wasn't quite there. It wasn't quite good enough. And then 2 more people would do the pull requests. And they were all sitting there concurrently in the old branches. The guy that originally opened this, I don't even think he writes PHP anymore. Eventually, it did get merged, but all the internal ones, just to the amount of the feature of how complicated it was, required a lot of effort to review it, to sort through it, and there was too much unknowns about how to implement it. And then the user's experience was basically, as a single maintainer, you have other things to do. You're not always around. Things get lost in the shuffle, especially if you click the GitHub notification, now it's gone. That was your record that it was something to look at, and now you opened it. And so sometimes I would open things with private browsing to make sure that I kept the notification there so I can go back to it. But many times I'd go back and the users were just there, ping, ping, can you look at this? Which is unfortunate. And so over time, the thing that, if I look at why did this take 5 years, it was I did a bad job of deciding to be weighing my perfectionism versus pragmatism. So the perfectionist says that I want everything refactored, I want full test coverage, I want all these features to be very stable, no edge cases, everything to be good and perfect. And the pragmatist says there's certain features I know I'm not going to do. I'm going to list those on the side. I'm going to focus on what I can get done now. And I'm going to tag a release with this API. And the issue I had with this was, with the pragmatism was, well, what if I didn't catch everything? And what if I need to change some of the API, and now I had 1.0? I can't do that now. I have to wait till 2.0. And so it was this fear, especially if John Wage was not around and it was just myself, to worry about, what maybe I'm making a mistake. I don't have the 6 or 7 people that are all working on ORM to review each other's code. But I will say, if you can control it, if you have a milestone and you're saying, when I'm going to fix this bug, don't keep throwing things into the same milestone. At some point, you have a milestone for the next patch release, say. So in Symfony's case, for Symfony 2.4 or Symfony 2.5, when they were adding new features to things, they would cut off the amount of time and say, your features have to begin by this point. PHP, the language, does this. They say if we're adding new features to PHP 7.1, which is now in its first beta, we can't add any more features to that. Now within the next month or two, we're going to be tagged and we're going to be released. So it's very important that if for your sanity that you just restrict the amount of things that get into your milestones and your buckets. If you don't do this, you're going to find the finish line is going to keep running ahead of you, and then you're driving, hopefully you're not Donald Trump, this political cartoon, but you're trying to get to that finish line, trying to get to the 1.0 or the 2.0 release, and you just find that your milestones keep getting more tickets, and you're never going to get there. And then you look back and you say, wow, it's been 5 years. I feel like an idiot. So, with that said, we did do releases over the time. So how did we tag the ODM over this time? So there's this, and I'm sure many are familiar with this, even if we don't directly work on the software, but if we have used software, used Composer. So you have semantic versioning with your major, your minor, your patch versions. And it basically means your major versions, if we bump this, we go from 1 to 2, that means that we broke something. So the API changes. And so that's what I was worried about. That limits me if I make 1.0 and I realized I needed to change something and I can't do it now. Now we have to go 2.0, and that doesn't make sense. The users are not going to appreciate that. Kind of something that if anyone uses Guzzle PHP, I heard people complaining that, well, Guzzle went from Guzzle 4 to Guzzle 5 to Guzzle 6 all in 1 year. And so you can't increment that too much. Minor versions, as we know from Symfony, that's when you have your new features. And then your patches are your bug fixes, and those should never break anything, not introduce new functionality. So I found a loophole here. There's the pre-release, which is when you do 1.0.0 dash in beta 1, and do beta 2, and beta 3. So we did this. And this is how we spent 5 years in beta. And I realized it was not good for the users ended up getting used to it. I wouldn't recommend anyone do this. This kind of happened by default, and you do it once and you're like, I feel bad. You do it again and again, and now it's just a pattern. And then people want new features. You say, okay, we'll do beta 10. We'll get that out next month as beta 10. And each one was basically in some regard a small breaking release. And we would have change logs that would say this broke, this broke. But it addressed the need that I was worried that I couldn't change the public API, and so there would be small breaks in between things. And it became a running joke. And this was April Fool's last year. We were talking about in the Doctrine IRC channel with the core developers. We were saying, well, we told them that we would tag 1.0 and 0.0 stable as our April Fool's joke. We didn't actually make a joke. I did tweet the meme, but that was it. But there needs to be a balance between your pragmatism and your perfectionism. So you do need to get your actual stable releases out there, because that tells so we had users to Doctrine that have been using it for as long as I've contributed, for 4 or 5 years, and they knew what it meant. Like a new beta release, okay, I test my application and I upgrade. OpenSky this whole time has been using Doctrine in that same way and growing as a company. But it's very bad for the new user that comes in and says, I don't see a stable release. It's a big turnoff. And then the balance is also not too many releases, like maybe in Guzzle's case, where you are putting out a new major version with breaking changes every few months. And then it's an issue of where people can't have compatible projects if they have some code that needs the old version and the new version. So there needs to be a balance defined. And so on the other side of this, just the experience of contributing to open source is a full-time job, or can be, depending. I mean, at some point you have to make money, but then some people will do 8 hours on their job and then go home 8 hours and then write code, play video games, and go sleep, and maybe catch some Pokemon. And this is a tweet that I was in Jordy when he gave a talk about what it's like running Composer and running Packagist. So really, the image has been retweeted and passed around. Maybe you've seen this before. But burning out by doing too much and then getting tired and then just deciding I can't do anymore. And so this is obviously someone's GitHub contribution graph. And see, around this time, the person they were doing something every day, and they just gave up and they reached a breaking point. In my case, I experienced this because I would get to work in the morning, and everything I get to do at MongoDB is open source, so I'm on GitHub all day in public repositories, which is great. But it means that the ODM stuff is right next to my driver stuff, so I see this constantly. So this is the worst thing I could find in the morning. I go there, I see unread notifications, and then there would sometimes be tweets that say, oh, were you able to look at this because someone pinged me on a GitHub issue and I missed it because I have hundreds of unread notifications. And a lot of times it meant that I had to put my driver work on hold and then take days or a week to work on ODM because switching back and forth just wasn't possible. And then sometimes, very rarely, this maybe happened twice or 3 times in 5 years, I'd get inbox 0 and I would have no notifications. I caught up with everything, and this would quickly stop. That 1 week I'd catch up on everything, and then I'd have to go back to do other tasks, and then I would lose it again. And every time I would get back, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. And at some point, as you're swimming along, the cruise ship is gone, and now you're sinking. There's sharks there. I don't know who the sharks are. Maybe that's the Propel developers or the CouchDB guys. And they're coming and they're waiting to kill me. And thankfully not in our case, but I think in a lot of cases where maybe the other person that burnt out, we see this maybe with how many, if you go on packages and look at Symfony bundles, how many are inactive but also unmaintained, where there's no one guiding them and they're broken. So this could lead to abandoned projects, which then puts the users obviously at a disadvantage. And so I asked myself, every time I'd go in and be overwhelmed by this, how did I end up in this spot? Well, why is everything depending? If I'm not around, then I feel like nothing is getting done here. And so originally, when I was first contributing, and over the beginning of the first 2 or 3 years, when I had an issue, I had a pull request I wanted to merge. Maybe it was my own. If it was my own, I definitely wanted someone to review it. If it was someone else's pull request, I can merge it myself. But I knew enough not to just commit things directly. It was always good to have someone review your code. So even today on the driver, Derek Rethens, who does all the PHP internal stuff, we review each other's pull requests. And he knows more about PHP internals than I will ever know. But he still has me review his stuff, and I review his, and he reviews my stuff. And so over the course of the 5 years, I would ping John Wage, because there was no one else to ask. Bulat wasn't working on this anymore. Ornikar was doing Scala. Chris Walsmith was working elsewhere on Symphony. There was no one to ask. So ping John Wage, maybe he's around, maybe he's not. Eventually, he's just never around, just has other stuff to do. Maybe just in a sink somewhere, I don't know. Just any reason to put this picture in here. And I basically realized I'm just alone. There's really no one to ask in this case for help. And to quote Cal Evans, and this was when I thought I was a contributor on the project. So Cal Evans has a quote. He was a community person. I think he's been to Europe a bunch of times. He talks a lot in the US as well. He runs different user groups. He runs a user group, Nomad PHP, which is an internet one if you don't have a local user group. But he has this quote, and he says, if you go around in your community and you realize there's no user group leader, then it's you. If you're the one to acknowledge that there's no user group, PHP user group, you're probably the one in charge. And so if I adapt this for an open source project, if you're using open source project and you realize there's no one maintaining it, and that's probably, and you have all these pull requests ready to do, and you're trying to fix things, you're probably now the maintainer. Tobias is right here in the front. He mentioned, he was talking earlier this week with Mailgun API. He was submitting a lot of pull requests to their PHP SDK, and they weren't getting, they were kind of sitting for a while. They eventually said, okay, you can just contribute them, and he's went through all of their issues and merged in like 50 different pull requests and issues for this company's SDK that was just sitting around. And so he, just by being interested in the project, no one else was doing it, he became the maintainer now. But so even if it is a lot of times done by one person, it should ideally be a team of people working for it. And I think that's where ORM is successful, because they've constantly had a team of 6 or more people always around in some capacity. These are the core folks, and Roman has not been around recently, but I would say all, including John, all 5 of these guys are in IRC constantly and talking. and they're supporting each other and things, so they don't have to do anything alone. Even if we look in Symfony's case, and this was back in 2011 at the Paris conference, this is before the core team existed, which I'll get to, but we were discussing very early on. There were more Symfony components. They needed to be supported. This was getting to be too much work for Fabian to do. I found out at that conference that he had a family. I assumed he was living by himself because he spends 20 hours a day coding. But he had other responsibilities in life to do. And so this was very early on where after this meeting, Bernard ended up taking over the form component. We had Johannes on the security component, and different people were responsible for different parts of Symfony. And later, this would become the Symfony core team, where now we have Fabian does not have to review and merge every pull request. I'm not Fabian Potencier. I don't run any of these accounts. None of these are me. But there's good things to take away from this, is that in any open source project, you want to take help and have other people come and join you. You should not be going about this alone. It's a difficult project, and it's also an issue of the bus factor, which is if you're the only one working and knows how things work, if you go outside and get hit by a bus or a taxi, there's no one else to take over. So that's why you always want a redundancy, not just in your database, but also with the other knowledge in the project. And so in the last 2 years, I started noticing a pattern of some of the pull requests we were getting. This is Maciej, who I always just refer to as Malars. But Maciej, sorry, so bad at this. So he was submitting a lot of pull requests. He was obviously using Doctrine. I was spending more time in the driver, and he saw like, oh, you obviously don't have time to respond to everything, so I'm just going to start doing pull requests and then send them to you. You could review them. And this came up in someone was asking about, well, when is ODM going to go stable? And this was after I'd been merging Maciej's pull requests for the last 4 or 5 months and noticing a trend. I said, well, he's actually been helping out, so maybe we can get him involved, and I don't have to be the only one to merge things. And he kind of was like Staff, where even in Symfony, before Staff was able to merge things, he would always pop up on issues and all over the place and just say, oh, this looks good, you have a bug here and things. And Maciej was doing the same thing for Doctrine. And so I ended up sending an email to the core team, and there's no real process for this. We just say, guys, do you mind if we bring another person in? This is their contributions, they look good. Everybody was +1, looks good to me. Okay, so we add him on GitHub, and then now he's able to merge and review things himself and joins the IRC channel. On the same token, Andreas is here in the front row, and he was also, I noticed, this guy also has too much free time because he's submitting pull requests and issues. And so we ended up making the same invitation to him to come on board. And he ended up working mostly, now he's also on ODM, but he was working mainly on not the ODM, but the abstraction layer. And so the takeaway from here was that identify the people that are helping out, because there's, in any large project, there's people interested, just like Melgun did with Tobias earlier. Encourage them to keep contributing, and then cultivate them into other volunteers, into teammates. Just like you would do if you're trying to hire someone at your company. Someone expresses interest in joining, or you find them and you find that they're working with you and try to bring them into the fold. So we fast forward a few months after Maciej was brought on board, and in the summer, I have more unread notifications, FML. But I go in and it's, Maciej is going down the entire list, and he's the most recent responder on all these issues, triaging everything, adding tags, cleaning up things, merging the trivial things, the small typos or test fixes. I'm going down this, and he's basically spent, 2 days straight going through and doing all this. And this is great, because now I can click mark all as read, and it's good, because I know he got to these. And this means that 1.0, brace yourselves, because the stable release is coming. He's resolving all these things. He's saying, these are the issues or pull requests that are definitely for 1.0. These are the ones that we're going to put to 2.0 or 1.1. And breaking out the things that we're going to be, the breaking changes, we'll do them now. And the things that they'll be breaking, but we can't deal with them now, we're going to put them off until 2.0. And so I credit, and I would give a round of applause at least because Andreas is here. But thank you. The two of them combined, and we had the original two guys that caused this mess, John Wage and Bulat, when they made the ODM, but then these two guys fixed it by actually getting us to the finish line. So I thank them for it. And I think this was probably one of Maciej's favorite things that he got to tweet. It's exciting to see him, even when he was volunteering, and I was thinking maybe you're spending too much time. But regularly he'd come into IRC and he would link to every time in GitHub when someone would thank him for merging a pull request or to thank him for responding or fixing something. He's like, oh, this is the little things that make me so happy to contribute. And I know this meant a lot to him to be able to tweet this out, and then all the Doctrine guys retweeted. It was a very exciting time. The ORM people were probably laughing at us, but it was still a cause for celebration. And so we were able to do this back in August. And when I originally submitted this talk to, I think for the Symphony conference last year, this is the first time I'm getting to give it. But I was submitting the talk right before we were about a month away from this. So the idea for the talk was back in June, July. So I thought it would be very good if we did actually make the 1.0 release, and we were able to make it on time, and we added an extra week just to do it on the birthday. So where do we go from here now that we are back to being a legitimate, stable project? So continuing all the triaging and the balancing perfectionism versus pragmatism. If you go to the two Doctrine projects today, there's the MongoDB ODM and then just MongoDB. You'll find actual milestones with tickets in them and things are actually progressing. And as well as the abstraction library, which Andreas primarily maintains, regularly making patch releases and things. And there's a sense of progression. I'd say even now, as Benjamin was mentioning, the ORM is kind of slowed down in the last few months, but certainly not dead. They're kind of thinking about what to do for the next version. All the ODM stuff is incredibly active, and regular releases every, let's say, month or month and a half. And then in the same token, the same way that I looked at Maciej getting interested and then invite him in, to see him go and do the same thing, and if you go to his Twitter account, this is his pinned tweet at the top, inviting people if they want to get involved, just like Symfony has, where they have the low-hanging fruit, the easy issues that you have easy bug fixes, or this needs a test, submit a test case. He's doing the same thing with ODM. So the paying off of encouraging him is now replicating because now he's able to encourage and groom other people. And at some point I expect he'll get tired, or he and Andreas will have other projects they might not be using ODM anymore. So you constantly want to have active people contributing. And additionally, the old thing I mentioned with PHP 7 being a challenge, because it requires rewriting for a new PHP extension. One of the things Andreas did in his spare time was to create a separate library, that kind of a polyfill, to take the old Mongo driver, implement the old API on the new PHP 7 driver. And so this is like we call it the Mongo PHP adapter. It basically allowed him to run the ODM test suite on PHP 7, which people had already been asking for this for months. They're saying, well, when are you gonna support PHP 7? So we want to upgrade and get all the other benefits. And the ODM itself was a great test case, both for him and for the new driver. So it was also amazing that he did this totally on the side. In addition to ODM, it helped us at the company because there were people who had been asking us to take the old driver, which was the old PHP driver, which was a mess, and move that and fix that for PHP 7. There was no resources to do that. So his library has been helpful for ODM and then just in general for the community. And I think that this might have never happened if he didn't invite him in to start contributing to Doctrine. And so as we look to the next changes that we think is to break, just here to look ahead, but there's always a matter of refactoring to definitely not need the adapter library to support PHP 7 properly. And then a lot of what we do here will be based on what Doctrine 3.0 decides to do. And as we both go to the next major version to sync up and make sure that we have comparable interfaces and are getting rid of and implementing the same features so that keep consistency for the users. And so this is where we are today, and I will see you again in 5 years. Thanks.